Welcome to Take Note for the second Masterworks Series concert of the 2021-2022 season of your Dayton Philharmonic. As you can see, it's a virtual Take Note. Once again, we're erring on the side of safety. Maybe by January we'll be able to have a traditional Take Note live in the theater, but for now we'll do it this virtual way. As we did last month, I will have two brief interviews with important guests for our program. First, composer Jennifer Jolley, whose wonderful piece called Blue Glacier Decoy opens the program. And then our guest soloist, cellist Mark Kosower, who's joining us to perform the Shostakovich Concerto No. 1. I'll return at the end of the program with some thoughts about Tchaikovsky's Pathetique Symphony. As always, many thanks to the Dayton Philharmonic Volunteer Association. For many, many years, they have sponsored the Take Note concert previews, both live and now the virtual version, and we appreciate everything that the DPVA does to help make the performances of the Dayton Philharmonic and our wonderful education programs possible. One little technical note, after last month's Take Note, I tried a couple of things differently with the interviews, hoping to get slightly better video quality. I think I did succeed in that, but the result was slightly less good audio quality. So I apologize for that. I brushed things up as well as I could. I think I'll probably go back to the old system if we have to continue with virtual Take Notes in the future. But so apologies for any weird audio during the interviews, and here come the interviews now.
The basic premise in Glacial Decoy is that at any moment your weight could go, your weight could shift forward, could shift back, just tiny right now, could shift side, could shift other side, or anywhere in between. So just give yourself a moment to feel this very mobile sense of how the balance is.
My first guest for Take Note for the November Masterworks concert of your Dayton Philharmonic is guest composer Jennifer Jolley, who wrote the piece which opens tonight's program called Blue Glacier Decoy. Jennifer, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I thought about a lot of possible ways to start this conversation, many questions that I could ask you. But I decided to start with the simplest question of all, which is, tell us about Blue Glacier Decoy. This is a piece that I have described to people. The three words I use the most in describing it are strange, beautiful, and haunting. Usually in some combination, hauntingly strange, strangely beautiful, beautifully haunting, that sort of thing. But rather than me tell the audience about the piece, let's have you introduce the piece to the audience, and then if I have follow-up questions, I can dive into those.
Sure. So I was asked to write a response piece for the Olympic National Park in Washington State. And I've never been to this national park, and I've never been to Washington State except maybe when I was a child. So I had to do a lot of research on this piece, and I thought the best way to approach it was to look at the late dancer choreographer Trisha Brown, who's from the Pacific Northwest. And she mentioned that the rainforest was her first art class. And I thought that was really touching. And in fact, at the Olympic National Park, there is a rainforest there, if you didn't know that. I certainly did not until I started writing this piece. And I thought that was really cool. She wrote a dance work called Glacial Decoy, and that there are just little tiny movements and tweaks that glaciers do over time, and she reflected that in her choreography. And I wanted to write a piece that reflected that. The glacier actually that I'm talking about is Blue Glacier, that's part of the Olympic National Park. And just write a piece kind of both in honor of Trisha Brown, but also the glaciers and its movement, and also the beauty that this national park brings, but also knowing that these glaciers are melting. And so musically, I wanted to do something that you hear in the chords, the main chords of the piece, that are throughout. I realize now that I wrote a Passacaglia, so you have a similar chord progression with slow changes over time. And so that's the genesis of the work.
Probably the most striking aspect of the work for any listener is hearing Trisha Brown's voice. That you have, you described this piece, I think, as being, in this version that we're playing for orchestra with electronics. Mm-hmm. So we have a whole series of short recorded snippets of Trisha Brown speaking. I've always imagined that she's speaking to her dancers, describing the quality of the movement that she's looking for. And what really strikes me about the piece is the affect of hearing the human voice as part of a piece of music. We're very familiar, those of us who grew up, with the idea of a storyteller with music from Peter and the Wolf or The Young Person's Guide. But in this piece, Trisha Brown's voice is really like an instrument. She's not really telling us a story. It's the sound and the quality of her voice that is so amazing. And then you do things to the sound. Over time, the sound kind of starts distorting, and we lose eventually most of the actual words. And then, of course, they come back at the end. It's such an amazing effect with such an amazing affect. So I'm just curious how that came to you and how you created and manipulated the sounds of her voice.
You know, you are absolutely right. She is talking to dancers. She was extracting the French opera ballet, if I remember correctly, like the basis of Glacier Decoy. And I thought it was a perfect parallel to describe not only just the glaciers themselves, which she's trying to mirror, but also musically, I tried to represent glaciers over time. And so at the beginning of the piece, you do have these very solid chords, and eventually they kind of disintegrate over time. And I thought I would like to treat Trisha Brown's voice in the same way. I don't necessarily hear it as an instrument, but more of like a chord, or it's a being. So at first you hear her voice completely intact, along with hearing the chords completely intact. And then over time, I do this process called granular synthesis, where I just kind of granulize, or it sounds like little grains of sand, her voice. And so over time, along with the chords, instead of being in a solid state dissipating, you also hear her voice dissipating at the same time over time of the piece, until the very end, where the chords come back together and also Trisha Brown's voice comes back together.
Now, that's actually very interesting, the way you describe the idea of the chords dissipating. Because in a way, I hear it almost the opposite. It's like because we hear the chords as just solid chords first. Mm-hmm. And then the chords actually come into motion. We start hearing the notes of the chords becoming melodies and intertwining counterpoint in the various instruments. But I hear it as like what am I trying to say here? The inherent meaning of the chord becomes enlivened over time. And instead of hearing it as a block, we hear it as something which fills time in a different way.
You're not wrong. I'm now thinking to the piece and how, in a way, I'm extracting the melodies, you know, that come from it. And maybe it's just like, I don't know, maybe it's like a block of clay or marble, and I'm not a sculptor, but just like the melodies were always there to begin with. And it's just me just trying to extract the movement in it. I think it's beautiful the way you describe it. I think it can go both ways.
Last question for you is, this is a piece, if I understand it right, that you wrote originally for sort of medium-sized wind ensemble, with some percussion and the electronics. So how did you decide to expand it into the version that we're playing, which is for full orchestra?
Yeah, so the Central Ohio Symphony in Delaware, Ohio, not too far away from Dayton,
Very
um,
close.
wanted to work with a photographer, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but he was actually the resident photographer for the U.S. interior. So his job was actually to go to all the national parks and take photographs of them. And this person is originally from Delaware, Ohio. And he wrote a book called Chasing Light, where he collects all of his photographs. He unfortunately passed away on July 4th, and he's just a really cool guy, and just loved the inherent beauty of nature. And so the Central Ohio Symphony created a project in which they would showcase this man's photographs, um, to highlight that. And so I thought, I said, I wrote a piece about the Olympic National Park. Again, I wanted to see more photos of it. And I thought it would be a very good fit. So I thought, why not, blow it up for orchestra, because the national parks are so grand and glaciers are so grand. It just seemed like a fitting thing to do with this piece. It should be bigger than what I originally intended it to be. I'm so glad it's for orchestra now, because again, it just encapsulates the grandeur and the different colors and timbres that the orchestra has that will bring the Olympic National Park to life.
Well, Jennifer, thanks so much for the piece, first of all, and thanks for joining us for Take Note. And I hope as the years go by and seasons progress, we'll be able to bring more of your music to our audiences in Dayton, and I hope bring you to be with us in person to hear it.
I would love to do that. I've gone to a couple of your concerts, and they're great, and you have a wonderful space. So I look forward to that in the future.
My second guest on Take Note for the November Masterworks concert is our soloist, Mark Kosower, principal cellist of our brothers and sisters to the Northeast, the Cleveland Orchestra. Mark is returning to us for at least the third time, maybe even the fourth. Mark, it's wonderful to have you returning to the Dayton Philharmonic, and welcome to Take Note.
Thank you, Neal. It's so wonderful to be here.
I thought we might start just by sort of comparing our experiences both during last season, during the COVID affected season, and now with both of our orchestras having launched our 2021-2022 seasons. Can you share with our viewers and our concert attenders a little bit about what last season was like at the Cleveland Orchestra and how things have begun for you this season?
Certainly. Well, we were one of the really fortunate organizations. Of course, when the pandemic struck, we were shut down like everybody else. But both the management and the musicians were quick to be creative and to stay relevant to the community during this time. We started when we couldn't be on stage by making socially distanced videos, which gave way to performances outside in the summertime in the community. Started a podcast on special events or moments in people's lives in relation to having been in the orchestra. And then when we had the opportunity to come back to the hall in the summer of 2020, they were very creative with socially distanced performances. I think the largest that summer was maybe 14 people in the Tchaikovsky Serenade for strings. And then finally, we were able to have a season of sorts. It worked out to be about 10 weeks of performing, but it was for never more than about 45 people until the later in the spring of 2021. And what these performances were basically recordings for our new digital streaming service, Adela. And this was a highly successful endeavor, and it was something the orchestra had been wanting to do anyway, but the pandemic really sped things up in terms of of getting this project off the ground, and this enabled us to not only reach our supporters in our area, but also to supporters worldwide, and it was really a fantastic thing.
I actually became a donor to the Cleveland Orchestra so that I could get access to the Adela streaming service. And my goal was to watch what you guys were doing and figure out how we could do something that would look and sound as close to what you were doing on a much skinnier budget.
Sure.
So you were the model that I was continually, I wouldn't say looking over my shoulder, because I was looking at my computer and television screen, but I was very impressed with what you did, and I was constantly saying, okay, how can we do something that's as close as possible to that?
The first time our orchestra played together with everybody was for the 4th of July concerts at Blossom.
At Blossom, right.
This summer. And we had 2 concerts that weekend. And I can't tell you the feeling I had when I walked out on stage at the first concert and saw about 12,000 people out there. And we had 20,000 people over the weekend. And just to feel the presence of so many people with us, I mean, it was really overwhelming, and so that was really the first sort of step to being together again. And then I would say the second step was this fall, the first time we're all together in Severance Hall, and then it was this past Thursday that was our first subscription opener. And was that ever exciting to have a really full house and to be playing a live radio concert, and one of the pieces was for a recording, and just the energy level, it was just really overwhelming. And so I can't tell you how important it is to have that person-to-person contact between musicians ourselves on stage and also with our audiences.
I think audience members often don't realize how important they are to us. And that they're not just people sitting in chairs in our peripheral vision, but we sense very keenly the energy that they bring to the performance, and we feed off of that. It's not the same when they're not there.
Absolutely, and it's part of the unsaid, or it's not a tangible. It's not something you can put your finger on, but it's absolutely what makes live performance as great as it is.
Let's talk a little bit about the concerto you're playing, Shostakovich's first cello concerto. This is a piece which was written for the great cellist Mstislav Rostropovich. I almost said that without stumbling on his name.
It's a mouthful.
So, and of course, Rostropovich over his lifetime gave so many amazing performances of this piece. He kind of owned it in a sense. I mean, many other cellists play it, but I'm curious, what's it like to play this piece? Because it's a very special and kind of unique concerto in the concerto repertoire. But also, the second part of the question is, what's it like to play it knowing the Rostropovich legacy? Is that something that, do you think about who he was as a cellist, or do you just think about who you are playing Shostakovich?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So many times, a particular artist becomes, sort of the household word, or like you said, say they own the piece. Rostropovich with the Shostakovich Concerto, Jacqueline Dupre with the Elgar Concerto. And I think what's important there is you have to put tradition a little bit aside and go kind of right to the source for yourself to try to find out what this music is, what is it about, to the best of our knowledge, what can we bring out of this music, the sort of the musical truth that we can use to really express the essence of the piece. And of course, we can use tradition to help us understand those things, but ultimately, I think this music needs to be a reflection of our own personal interaction with the composer, because only that way are we going to be able to find the truth for ourselves.
With Shostakovich, there's so many people who feel, and I'm sort of one of them, that to fully understand a lot of his pieces, you have to know something about the political and social times that the music came out of. And of course, when we play the piece of music, it's a piece of music, and our job is to play the music as he wrote it. But I'm curious, there are some people who think, especially with a concerto like this, that there's something special about the idea of a concerto, of an individual player playing as a soloist, that in the Soviet context is itself perhaps a slightly dissident thing. When you live in a collective society and you're a composer who is putting an individual out in front, there's some people who think that is inherently a political statement of a sort. So do you involve yourself at all in it? There used to be a big controversies about the political side of Shostakovich, and it's kind of died down, fortunately, now, and we can just think more about the music. But I'm just curious, as a performer of this piece, where do you come down on that, and does it inform your performance in any way?
Well, I think what's important, and especially if you're looking at music that comes out of the Soviet era, we have to be thinking in terms of layers and layers of meaning. And especially for somebody like Shostakovich, who I think was continuously making political statements through his music, but writing in a coded way so that only the people it was intended for would understand, and not the regime who was, censoring him from time to time, and he was always in danger of being eliminated by. And certainly, the cello concerto is no exception. I find it very interesting what you said about the idea of a concerto with one person standing out in front, being against, what communism stands for. Of course, it makes perfect sense. But in the case of this piece, I mean, what I find is that on the surface level, it's very much, it could be, it's in the key of E flat, which historically is the key of nobility. It's, it's about
and heroism also.
Exactly, heroism and really military might. I mean, starts with, he says the first movement is a type of military scherzo, and it's very clear even without him saying that, and also into the last movement. But there are different layers. If we go one layer deeper, if the meaning of this piece would have been questioned by the authorities, he can point to the fact that he used music from his film music, The Young Guard, in the first movement, which is about the marching of Soviet soldiers to their death by the Nazis. So he can kind of pin this off on Nazi Germany.
And he quotes Stalin's favorite folk song in the last movement. So yes, he's ticking all the plausible deniability boxes there.
Yes, check. Has everything to pass censorship. But I think, at the end, on the deepest level, we know that this is first and foremost, a reflection on Soviet oppression and on, perhaps what an individual's experience living in that society. And perhaps that's what the soloist is doing throughout the concerto, just showing for, whether it's an average citizen or a specific person, but nevertheless, what it's like for a person to live in this society.
I am so thrilled that you're coming back to play with us. I'm so thrilled that you're playing this amazing and wonderful piece, and I can't wait for it. And thank you so much for joining us for some thoughts about the music before you play it.
Thank you, Neal. I'm so looking forward to this.
Tchaikovsky is a composer whose music I really love. And that doesn't make me special. Audiences have always loved Tchaikovsky's music. But Tchaikovsky is a composer who I think does not get enough credit for what a great composer and what a skillful composer he was. We all know that Tchaikovsky wrote beautiful melodies And this is really the heart and core of his appeal. But, there are people who think, well, if a composer is so popular and writes these beautiful melodies, there must be something wrong with what they're doing. And in Tchaikovsky's case, that's completely crazy. Tchaikovsky was a very skillful composer, and we hear that in display in all kinds of ways in his last symphony, the Pathétique Symphony, which premiered just a matter of days before Tchaikovsky died. This is a piece which is a very personal and passionate piece of music. In fact, the Russian word that got translated into French as pathétique is the word which means passionate. It has nothing to do with pathetic. This is a passionate symphony. That was what Tchaikovsky's brother Modeste said when he heard the music. This is such a passionate piece of music, you should call it the Passionate Symphony. And in French, it came out pathétique, and then in English, it comes out pathetic, which is pathetic because it's nothing at all like that. Tchaikovsky poured all of his emotions into this piece of music. But like so many of Tchaikovsky's pieces, it is full of all kinds of wondrous things beyond the emotion. In the first movement, lots of intricate counterpoint and handling of the musical materials. The second movement, a waltz, but it's a waltz in 5/4 time instead of 3/4 or 6/4 time. It gives it a different kind of emotional feel and a different kind of a lilt. In the third movement, he smushed together two completely different musical ideas, the idea of a scherzo, the traditional dance movement of a symphony from the era of Beethoven, certainly. He combined a scherzo and a march together in one movement, which is part scherzo, part march, and part this strange, what we would call nowadays, a mashup. And then the incredible imaginative leap of putting a slow movement at the end of the symphony, writing at the end of the third movement a finish that sounds very much like the finish of his fourth symphony and very much like the finish of his fifth symphony, to, I guess, almost to fake the audience into thinking the symphony's over and jump to their feet and yell, bravo, everything's wonderful. And then this incredibly sad finale begins, as if to say, no, you think you know what's going on. You think this is a triumphant ending to a piece of music, but actually my heart is filled with all of this sadness. And this is what I'm going to show you in the last movement. It's an absolutely staggeringly beautiful and staggeringly powerful piece. And I hope when you hear it, you will love it as much as I do. Thanks for joining me for this virtual Take Note presentation. Enjoy the concert, and I hope we'll see each other in person for Take Note at our January Masterworks Series concert.